As we've already discovered from India's naming, foreigners have been fascinated with India for thousands of years. Some have been simply intrigued with the culture and natural environment. Others have wanted to trade with India and do business with the Indians. Many have also sought Indian knowledge, and of course there were those who invaded. Let's briefly highlight some of the different motivations foreigners have had to engage with India. To the west, there is evidence of Indian trade with Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, in the 3rd millennium BCE. For thousands of years, in fact, Egyptians, Africans, Arabs, Persians, Central Asians have all been trading with India, not to mention further afield the Greeks and the Romans. Renaissance Italians from Venice were buying spices indirectly from India through Egypt and the Levant in the 15th century. And of course, once Vasco da Gama had rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1498, the Portuguese, followed by other Europeans, established colonies here, culminating in nearly 200 years of British control of the Indian subcontinent. First under the world's first multinational corporation, the English East India Company, which then became the British East India Company, and then for 90 years under direct British government rule, what we now call the British Raj. The stories of India's relationships with the East, with the countries and peoples lying to its east, is more different. India has been trading for thousands of years with the peoples of what are now the countries of Myanmar, Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, Indonesia, China, Korea, Japan. But the difference is that the people to India's east never sought to invade India. And in fact, they began to adopt and adapt elements of their own culture to India's. Most famously, of course, with the Hindu religions coming into Southeast Asia, followed by Buddhism, which then spread all the way through the north of Asia into China, Japan, and Korea. These interactions peaked during the last few centuries of the 1st millennium AD, but they carried on for hundreds of years after that, right up to the 15th, 16th century. Whilst Europe was in the Dark Ages, following the collapse of the Roman Empire in the 4th, 5th century, India and those parts of Asia inspired by India were having their golden age. In fact, until 500 years ago, much of Asia, and therefore much of the world, had been under such a strong Indian influence for more than 1,000 years, not just thanks to India, but also to the religions, the architecture, and even the languages that came from this country. We shall look at some examples of the extensity and intensity of this trade and the exchange of ideas that ensued during next week's lesson, where we'll look more at history. But for now, what I want to do is highlight a major difference between India's historical relationship with those people to its west and to its east. Whilst the exchange of ideas as well as trade has flowed in all directions, the major interventions and invasions which punctuate India's history have all come from people to India's west and northwest. Afghans, Greeks, Persians, Mongols, Mughals, Portuguese, French and British, Christians and Muslims. As well as those seeking to trade with India, many have sought to seize control and convert others to their own worldview. India's relationship with the East has therefore been markedly different. It's been much more peaceful and is therefore perhaps less well known. There's less history, if you like, because there's less battles and events and invasions. In addition to trade, it has included India's intellectual influence spreading outwards in a far more dramatic fashion than it ever did to the West. Indian-originated ideas, beliefs, stories, knowledge, art and architecture were absorbed and adopted throughout Southern and Eastern Asia. Next week, we'll explore how the Indian-originated worldviews, first Hindu and then most successfully Buddhist, became so dominant that until just 500 years ago, they held the kind of influence on humanity that we now consider the West having today. With Asia once again becoming the engine of growth for the world economy, it's worth appreciating the dynamics of this part of the world as it was 1,000 years ago, 500 years ago. And also noting the way that India's present Prime Minister is shifting gears from a look east policy to an act east policy. Much like 1,000 years ago, India is rapidly strengthening its ties with the 10 Southeast Asian ASEAN countries. and its immediate southern Asian neighbours, Nepal, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Bangladesh. This time around, China and Japan are also increasingly investing in India, both at a governmental level in infrastructure, bringing things like bullet train technology to India, but also at a private level with things like $5 to $10 billion, which the Japanese SoftBank is going to be investing in Indian tech startups. And there's a number of other recent tie-ups between Chinese and Indian e-commerce companies. For example, Alipay, which is part of Alibaba, and Paytm, which is an Indian e-commerce unicorn startup. Taiwanese Apple supplier Foxconn is about to invest $5 to $10 billion, reportedly, in the Indian state of Maharashtra, which is where Mumbai is based. So your iPhone, maybe 9 or 10, could be assembled in India, as well as partly engineered by Indians working for Apple in Silicon Valley. Foreign companies have been investing heavily in India over the last few years. According to the Financial Times, India is now actually the largest recipient of foreign direct investment in the world, overtaking China as the largest recipient in 2015. As well as business leaders, political leaders have been beating their path to Delhi and the political capital of India to meet with the Prime Minister, President and the various ministries of the Indian government. And they're coming to India with increasing frequency. It's hard to believe, given all the attention it has received since the millennium, over the last decade or so. But for several decades, India was not on many world presidents' or prime ministers' international travel itineraries. Just taking the example of America. President Nixon visited for just a day in 1969. President Carter spent 3 days in India in 1978. President Clinton was here for 5 days in the year 2000, and President George W. Bush came here in 2006. Now, President Obama has visited India twice. In fact, he's the first US president to do so. He visited once in 2010 and once again last year in 2015. In fact, President Obama has also begun and ended his time in the White House with visits from Indian prime ministers. Manmohan Singh first in 2009 and Narendra Modi in 2016. Perhaps it's no surprise, given that President Obama believes that America and India will have the defining relationship of the 21st century.